Well, last week, the federal government released its latest budget, and it was released during a time where Canada faces many economic challenges: high inflation, low business investment, and low productivity, and an increasingly competitive environment thanks to the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. And we have high environmental and economic ambitions, but we need to move at a speed and a scale never before seen to meet them. So, does Budget 2023 help us get there? Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. And on today's episode, we are joined by the Business Council of Canada's Senior Vice President of Policy, Robert Asselin, to discuss Canada's economic challenges and to reflect on Budget 2023. We'll discuss the importance of Canada's newly announced tax investment credits for hydrogen and other programs, the Green Electricity Program, the urgent need for a Canadian Advanced Research Projects Agency, and where we fell short in the latest budget. And we'll also reflect on the economic policies that could really change the tide and where Canada can focus its attention in the short and long term to help turn things around. If you find this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show. Robert, thank you so much for joining us on Alberta Better. Almost 2 years ago, we had you on the podcast talking about, I think, productivity. And that's going to be a bit of a theme again in today's episode because we were talking about federal budget. But we've had a lot of new listeners over the last 2 years. So, for anyone who doesn't know you yet, would you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work at the Business Council of Canada?
Yes, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Robert Asselin. I'm Senior Vice President Policy at the Business Council of Canada. We represent CEOs of Canada's largest companies. I head the policy team at the Business Council. We try to be thought leaders. We try to obviously influence public policy. We're really focused on a few big things. The energy transition, obviously, where Alberta is obviously very key to. We're focused a lot on industrial strategy and innovation because they are key drivers of growth. And then on economic immigration and skills in general, because this is what our companies need to more performant and enhance their productivity going forward.
So before we jump into the meat of our conversation here around policy ideas and maybe your lukewarm response to this week's federal budget, what's keeping you up at night? What's kind of occupying your mind these days?
I think what keeps me up at night, it's the relative complacency of our governments. And I would say even our Canadians, we're a very successful country, very fortunate country. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else in the world, but I think we're not living to our potential. And right now there are a lot of big things, big plays being made around the world. And I feel we're either reacting or we're not charting our own course vis-a-vis these challenges. And so, I'll give a concrete example, on structural deficits, for example, when we talk about the fiscal situation, people are like, oh, we're not that bad, Japan is worse than us.
Right.
Is doing worse. And then the United States is boring as much as we do. So it's okay. Or, we're not as productive as we should be as a country producing goods and services across the economy, but look at the numbers, they're not that bad. So for me, those are kind of traps where I see our potential, given our human capital, given our successful immigration system and policy. And I just feel overall we're punching way below our weight. We could do much more ambitious and just charting a more kind of bold vision for the future, I would say is my overall comment on what kind of bugs me these days.
It's a great answer. Classic Canadian complacency. And, I think you painted a picture there of what a wonderful place we live in and our potential. But we've also got some challenges, Robert. You penned an op-ed recently in the Globe and Mail, and you talked about the 3 converging economic challenges that Canada's facing. Talk to us about that.
So the first big problem we have is our fiscal situation. Again, I recognize some think it's totally fine and we can borrow our way to growth. I don't believe so personally. I think we now have a structural deficit that is more or less at the federal level, 1.5% GDP. This is before new spending and before a further economic and fiscal deterioration, which is likely given where we're going. The second is what I called our trade deficit or our current account deficit, which speaks to our inability to export more than we import in key industries. And the emphasis I put there is on advanced industries. I think you don't need to have a positive balance or trade surplus in some verticals, including stuff that a lot of countries make that don't require a lot of high inputs. But I think if overall in advanced industry where there's a high intensity of R&D, of high skilled workers, you are across the board in a deficit position. In other words, you import everything that you need as opposed to exporting, then you're going to have a competitiveness challenge. And I think this is where we are in key industries. Now, I just want to make a bit of a nuanced statement here. It's not that we don't have Canadian champions in advanced industries. It's just that we don't have enough of them. And that's a problem going forward. And the third challenge is linked to the two I just described, which is a path to growth, to economic growth that is quite challenging, very anemic. Obviously, we live in a global economy that is challenged right now, but overall, I look at the economic outlook and it's not good. It's below 2% real GDP across the board. And that points to lower GDP per capita going forward and diminishing living standards, which at the end is the real threat for all of us, I think.
Yeah, declining quality of life for Canadians. Robert, I'm sure you know that we, like many people, have been very interested in the United States' hilariously misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, which I think has very, very little to do with reducing inflation. In fact, you could probably argue the amount of money it's pouring in, if anything, it's working in the other direction. But despite the funny name, it's really created competitiveness challenges for Canada. Talk to us about that. How serious of a threat to our competitiveness is the United States' IRA?
It's the biggest play the US has done since, I would argue, the Apollo program of the 60s, when President Kennedy went to Rice University challenging Americans to send an American to the moon before the end of the decade. In current dollars, it's about twice as big as was Apollo program then. And I think people need to also understand IRA, as we used to call it now, is a big part of the package, but it's not all the package of industrial policy in the US. They have added a big infrastructure package. They added a big science and Chips Act package, which speaks to the science technology kind of play and aspect to their industrial strategy. All this put together, I think is something that as a country, obviously is very threatening because it's a protectionist play for the Americans. And although we are integrated in a lot of their supply chains, including in automotive, there's a lot of things they want to manufacture and they want to produce on their own. And that's really the core of the challenge, is that we're going to need to be better, more competitive if we want market shares in these key advanced industries I just referenced earlier.
And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the budget later, Robert, but given we're talking about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, how competitive do you think that we are with the IRA as of this most recent federal budget?
So federal government response essentially, I think, to be fair, it's not just this budget, but I think some of the elements that were contained in last budgets, because they have been investing in some of these green economy initiatives for some time. But when I look at the specifics for this budget, it's essentially very generous tax credits on, I would say, three big things. One is electricity and renewables production, which I think is probably the most positive piece of the budget. Then they have a clean tech manufacturing tax credit that is much smaller. And they have a hydrogen tax credit that is also, I think, that raises a lot of question whether we'll be able to really excel in that lane, because as you know, it's very nascent And it's complicated to go through that path because right now it's not very economic to produce and distribute hydrogen at scale. And so I go back to the electricity tax credit. I think it's very positive because it's foundational to everything we do when you talk about decarbonization. And if we don't get more electricity production, clean electricity production, everything else is kind of stuck in the pipeline. Kind of very important to start there. We're already doing well compared to a lot of countries. I think 80%, if you include nuclear, is of our grid is clean. If we get that to over 90, I think it'll make us much more competitive. I would just want to say on tax credits and themselves, as I said, I think they are positive. To me, they're just not an economic vision or a fulsome industrial strategy. I think we missed the mark on the science and technology play. We missed the mark on picking a few more lanes on growth, because growth is not just limited to the clean economy, right? Although it is a big part of it. So I'm still, budgets. There always be more budgets, so one has to continue to hope. But I'm still somewhat unsatisfied by what was produced this week.
I want to ask you about productivity, because that was one of our key topics, as Brittany mentioned off the top, that came up last time. And I often say, I feel like we need a different word for productivity, because I think a lot of ordinary people hear that word and they think it means that they're going to have to work harder at their job. If they produced 10 yesterday, they'll have to do 12 tomorrow. When in many ways, it's the opposite, right? It's getting more value for every hour that you work. I feel like this is something we've talked about in Canadian policy for a long time now, probably more than a decade. Yeah. But I'd like your latest update, Robert. How are we doing on productivity? Are we better or worse off than last time we talked to you?
Unfortunately, I don't have good news. It's not getting any better. Actually, it's getting worse relative to the Americans, for example. Our output per worker is on a declining path. And there are several factors in play. One is we are right now growing our population really rapidly through immigration. That has an effect on bringing down GDP per capita. So it makes us a bit less productive per capita.
Or at least appear so.
Yeah. And so this is why it's really important to kind of be better at economic immigration, bring people with high skills that we can employ at their own full potential, I would say. Then the business investment part is really discouraging, very low, due to two things. One is lack of scale, lack of large firms in the economy. We're still very much an economy of SMEs. And by definition, small and medium businesses don't invest as much in the R&D as large firms. And then industrial composition, which speaks to the over-reliance on residential investments in the economy, and not enough scale in advanced industries where there's a high concentration of R&D and technology and high-skilled workers. This is where we need to compete. This is where we need to get better. In other words, an economy that doesn't produce, doesn't innovate, won't do as well as an economy that is more or less just based on a consumption model, which is what we are more or less these days. So it's a big shift, and not something that will happen over a budget or two. Right. But I feel again, speaking to my ambition kind of thinking at the beginning of the podcast, I'm not seeing this vision. I'm not seeing this transpire to document government announcements, policies, budgets. And I feel if we don't get there, again, not to be too pessimistic, but our living standards will fall. And it's not, again, that Canada will become a poor country suddenly. It's just that we'll be relatively poor, and it will be over time. And at one point, we'll see a big difference,
Children being worse off than their parents is a scary thought. So you're a policy guy, Robert. I'll put you on the spot. If you had to pick one policy, you could wave your magic wand to address some of these economic woes, these challenges that we've just talked about here. Where's the biggest opportunity for leverage?
It's become an innovative country. It's really around innovation. We've seen innovation in this country as mainly adopting technology, and it's a big part of it, no question. But I find our science technology architecture is just not geared to innovation. In other words, we think R&D in itself will produce innovation. We have not constructed the necessary bridges between
The
intellectual
research.
exactly and
Yeah.
private firms. And so this is where the problem is. And then I think if I had one thing I'd work on, night and day, if I'd go back to government, it would be that, because I think this is where countries are heading. You look at the US and the big play they are making on, three big families of technology, computing related technologies, AI, quantum, microelectronics, biotech, another big family of
Mm,
technology, and the third family of technology is clean tech. I don't see an agenda in these three families of technology here in Canada
mhm,
where actually we have some strengths and we could do much better. I keep repeating the same thing, but it's true. R&D is not innovation. We just need be better at understanding that and bringing industry and academia together in these kind of modern incarnation of corporate labs that we used to
mhm.
have that we don't anymore.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit deeper into the actual budget that was released this week. So, if the budget kind of fails to present a vision and live up to what Canada could offer, let's go through kind of each of the pieces here. So, one of the other things when it comes to growth, we've got productivity, but then we also have business investment. What did you and the Business Council of Canada kind of make of the budget from that perspective?
Again, I think the tax credits that were presented were mostly well targeted, well thought of. I will give the government credit for that. They were in the right direction, in the right sectors too, for the clean economy. But on themselves, they are insufficient to solve the problems identified, which essentially are scale, too many SMEs, and second, not enough competitive in these advanced industries I described. So we really need to focus our industrial strategy in these two things. And science and technology, I think, is a big part of it, because if you don't, nurture your talent into ideas into private firms, you're going to be always on the takers mode as opposed to on the makers mode. And I find in the kind of intellectual and tangible economy we're heading towards, this will be a big disadvantage for Canada.
Hmm. Well, and on the tax credits, you noted that these are put in almost the right industries for Canada's, environmental goals and hydrogen and CCUS and greening up our electricity grid. From the council, like our council's perspective, we've been working on a major projects and approvals process to kind of accelerate Canada's regulatory approvals and review process. And, we saw the budget commit a little bit towards accelerating those processes. And, Canada can build, we have built big things, and, to meet our goals, we need to build big things, but those processes are standing in the way. What did you see? Like, what was your reaction in terms of accelerating regulatory approvals and getting big things built? Because we need to get those big things built in order to
Right.
be competitive, in order to be productive.
And that's another layer of the industrial strategy that is so key, because you can have funding mechanism, strategic funding, but if you don't have the regulatory regime that allows business to invest at scale and feel confident that these investments are sound over time, because we're talking about big capital investments here
Mhm.
for the kind of the energy transition we need in an energy intensive economy like ours, you're not going to get through. And at least I was encouraged to see the government mentioning this kind of direction, that they are at least recognizing the problem of approvals and permitting. But if you look at mining, if you want to have a critical mineral strategy and it takes 15 years to get a permit, this is not just on the federal government, by the way, all levels of government together, you're gonna not gonna be able, you're gonna miss the boat. China is so ahead already. And so
Mhm.
it's that kind of nimbleness and sense of urgency sometimes we're lacking
Mhm.
in Canada, because we are comfortable nation. We know that somehow we're going to be okay, but in this world of geopolitical competition, urgency and nimbleness and speed are all really important.
Mhm. We've mentioned the phrase like speed and scale several times in some of our pieces.
And I also love that you said sense of urgency, Robert. I think that's just one of the things we need as a country. There's this restaurant in downtown Calgary. Next time you're here, I'll take you to it. And the kitchen is open to the whole restaurant. It's run by some of the culinary students that work for our Institute of Technology called SAIT. And anyways, they have a huge sign that you can see in the kitchen that says sense of urgency. And you can tell that the chefs are just, trying to get everyone to think and move that way. And I think about that all the time, that, Canada needs a giant sign, hanging above our country that says sense of urgency.
If I can add something there, I think it's really important is most countries who are good at industrial policy, and there are not many of them, or at innovation, they have historically felt an important threat coming at them. Think about Israel with cybersecurity, for example. Think about the US and what they did on space and defense in reaction to the Sputnik crisis and the Russians beating them to space.
Yeah.
Think about Germany in advanced manufacturing and how they had to build this production capacity for the wars they fought and rebuild their countries after the wars. I mean, this in Netherlands, country half the size of New Brunswick, that became the second world exporter in ag food because they starved to death, after World War. And so these crises and these kind of big threats, when they come, they make you react. In Canada, when we got to the beginning of the COVID crisis, suddenly you saw all these public-private partnerships on PPE, on vaccines, and suddenly everyone was working together, producing things. It's that kind of a threat environment that we need going forward, and think of ourselves as threatened somehow by the world, but in a good way, in a way that makes us better. I just feel that speaks to the sense of urgency we need,
This budget, at least my takeaway, is that there's so much spending and there's not really like a plan to fiscal balance. And I think you and the president of Business Council Canada, Goldie Hyder, also noted this, that the government has kind of abandoned its own fiscal anchor, right? So paint a picture for our listeners, what are you seeing and what's kind of the faux pas that the government has made when it comes to addressing Canada's financial stability? And further on that, like, what is the path out of Canada's current fiscal or financial position, and how do we start addressing our debt?
Well, this is a big question in a sense that there are a lot of views out there that it's okay relative to other countries. We're doing, as I said, not that bad when you compare our federal debt with other countries. There are a few problems with that. First is the trend. Spending per capita is very high. The percentage of spending and programs versus the GDP is historically, I would say, higher than it was in the 90s and the 2000s. We don't have a fiscal anchor anymore. Their own debt to GDP ratio is going up as opposed to go down next year. So from their own admission, it doesn't work anymore. I think the danger is threefold. First is, as I said, per capita spending that is not controlled, going up. They keep adding spending every budget, every fall statement. So unconstrained spending, that will cause the fiscal framework to deteriorate further. And this is without a recession. This is without all the stuff that they have not spent money on, including defense, which we will need to address given the global situation and the situation in Ukraine and with China. The second problem is an economic outlook that is deteriorating pretty fast. If you look at their own projection, it's below 2% over the forecast horizon in real GDP. And the third, which is I think the most important, is debt servicing costs. The interest we're paying on our debt to refinance over time. If you look at their own projections from 2021-22 to 26-27, we will double our debt charges, coming to about 50 billion in 26-27, which represent just a bit less than what we will transfer to provinces for healthcare services. So that gives you a sense of the proportion of where we're going with this. So I think as a finance minister, the idea is to think about these risks and try to be prudent. What I didn't see in this budget, by the way, that was telegraphed as fiscal restraint, is prudence. Is nothing but prudent what they have done. They have added significant billions into the fiscal framework, 43 billion over 6 years. And they keep adding at that pace. As I said, every fall statement, every budget, they have spent, by my count, $345 billion since budget 2021. That's only 2 budgets ago, by the way. So that gives you a sense of the direction. And will the sky fall tomorrow morning? No. But if we continue on that trend with these 3 big elements that I described, I think we're going to run into some trouble.
I can't help myself but ask this self-indulgent question, but what would you say to people who would respond to that and say, well, Canada can just print more money, so let's just do that?
Well, it's just a misunderstanding of economics, to be honest. The people who advocate for that kind of stuff, the MMT theory, just don't understand that, there's not an infinite supply of money in the economy. And that money comes from somewhere at a rate of borrowing that the lender can decide and can charge on our debt. And what happened in the 90s, obviously, is that Canada became a country that was seen as having, a path to unsustainability. So people start asking, David Dodge, former Deputy Minister of Finance, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, tells that story when he went to a cabinet meeting saying to ministers in 94, I think, that there was a bond auction and that nobody wanted to buy our bonds because this is the situation where we were in. And so obviously this is not to compare the 90s with today. It's just to say that you can't take things for granted, and fiscal management is really important. And for businesses, investments, they are key, because if down the road it is seen as you will have higher deficits, higher debt servicing costs, what that points to is higher taxes.
Higher taxes.
And that points to a climate that is not incentivizing business to come to Canada and invest and grow in Canada. And so the link between the two are actually much more important than we gave people credit for.
Yeah, there's that long-termism link, and yeah, the implication of potential future taxes. If you look at the fiscal trajectory, businesses will kind of bake that in and say, if we think this is the trajectory the country's headed on, we assume that might mean higher taxes, so we won't go there, we won't invest there. I think that's an excellent point.
And to state the obvious, we're a high tax jurisdiction in Canada. On the income tax in most provinces, people at the high end are over 50% of marginal tax rate. Our corporate rate is comparable to other OECD countries, G7 countries, but it's still not low. And this idea that, it will come from wealthy people, well, if you chase all wealthy people from the country because they're not seen as, a citizen who can contribute to this country, and are seen almost as cheater or traitors, they will go elsewhere. And you will find yourself with, less and less wealth. Again, large businesses, large companies employ Canadians. They give higher wages than SMEs. They employ, proportionally speaking, people from diverse backgrounds. And so, wealth comes with responsibility for companies, but for the government, it needs to recognize that being successful in an economy is not a bad thing. It's a thing that should be celebrated,
Celebrated and rewarded. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
And on this topic, I have to do my job as a good Albertan and point out that we have a top marginal tax bracket that is under 50% and kind of competitive when looked at through the lens of much of the rest of Canada. But of course, let's talk about some of the way out of this. Robert, you've written extensively with several papers and a number of pieces with another friend of ours, Sean Spear, and yours as well, on this new North Star concept. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're arguing for here, and maybe expand more? You said earlier, R&D is an innovation. What do you mean by that, and what are you suggesting with New North Star?
So yeah, Sean and I started to talk about industrial policy before it was cool. Yeah, before it was cool, like 3-4 years ago. I think we saw where this was going. In fact, I wrote a piece in the Globe and Mail in August 2020 when President Biden was just a candidate for his own primary election and in his own party, saying this was obvious that it would be coming and Canada had to prepare for it. just a set of tools that we need to use to be much more intentional about our own long-term economic growth, competitiveness, and building a long-term plan, an action plan that where basically the government is a partner with private industries to create wealth in this country. And it's something that is quite straightforward. You start with how do you build and science and technology architecture that is conducive to wealth creation. And we advance this idea of an advanced research agency for Canada that would work on breakthrough technologies in key sectors: energy sector, ag sector, life and biosciences, where we would create and transfer our intellectual capital into private firms, as I said. Then the regulatory piece is really important, as we discuss. And then the human capital part of it. There's a lot of talent in this country, both from immigration, but from a population that is highly educated. Somehow we need to translate that into the real economy. And so, a STEM agenda that is much more aggressive with higher targets. As I said, we need to recreate these corporate labs with industrial research at scale and key advanced industries. And so an industrial policy that is not about subsidies and not being about spreading the peanut butter in 44 sectors and all the regions of Canada, but really focused on four things and four big sectors that where we can succeed. I think this is where successful countries do. Again, I go back to my US example in space defense. Now we're doing it with biopharma and clean tech and computing related technologies. I look at Netherlands in ag tech. I look at Germany in advanced manufacturing. Canada can excel in a few big ways, but cannot be a player in 14 sectors. And again, in these sectors, we need to be specific. For EVs, for example, I think we can contribute a lot in the battery space because we have critical
minerals.
Minerals, we have talent, we have R&D capacity. But this is a good example. Let's make sure we just don't assemble a bunch of things and that we actually contribute to the R&D commercialization of how the battery will evolve over time.
One of the points you make is that I think is somewhat poorly understood, is that many of the big technology breakthroughs that we've had over the past century have actually been governments and business working together on those things. And you referenced some of them, but the obvious examples would probably come from DARPA in the United States. The fact that we have global positioning, satellites, and the internet, and things like that. You've advocated for the idea of a CARPA, or a Canadian version of the DARPA, which I just love, and it focuses the mind. The current government has pledged to create something that sort of sounds like that, an innovation and investment agency instead. Right. How similar are these concepts? How satisfied are you with that idea, and where does it stand now?
We don't know yet because it's very new, ill-defined, I would say. There was a blueprint that came out that didn't say much. I think intentionally because the government wants to make sure that it can do many things. Again, what I hope is that it won't be spread too thin. It won't try to do too much. But what it will do well. And I'm hoping that breakthrough technology, applied research in these key sectors where we have comparative advantage will be one of them. I'm thinking, clean tech for our energy sector, for example.
CCUS. Would that be like carbon CCUS and those sorts of technologies? Yes.
Yeah. I mean, ARPA-E, which is the equivalent of DARPA in the US for energy, just worked with GE and they announced this air capture project that is absolutely amazing. And it came with this public-private partnership and this model of ARPA. And what it does essentially is just de-risk private investment, but private sector has to put its own skin into investing its own money to make it work. It just knows that it has a government partner that is there with them to do so. And the results are just amazing. So I just think it's about time for Canada to rethink its innovation system, be much bolder about it, and kind of lean into these breakthrough technologies that can be worked through public-private partnerships.
And not spread it too thin. What a great point. As Canadians, I think we're famous for spreading the peanut butter too thin and doing just enough that we're not effective. You know,
Exactly.
Robert, as we wrap up, what is one policy idea or insight or idea that that our listeners should take away from this conversation today?
I would hope that we would create this advanced research project agency in a sector in one of our key advanced industries. I think it should be around energy and clean tech because this is where most of our wealth come from. And given the size of our energy companies, given the size of our energy sector, I'm confident we could absorb these inventions into a lot of our sector and grow out of it. Look, we've done it for oil sands. People were very skeptical 50 years ago we could do this. We did. And it was, by the way, through industrial policy with Peter Lloyd and how he brought the Oyster program together, which was really much a private-public enterprise.
Very much. It unlocked a generation of prosperity, you know?
Correct. Not just for Alberta, but for the country. I think it's important to say that. Now we have to go to a low-carbon economy. Everybody is conscious of that. Everybody is there. But, you know, this will happen mainly through technological innovation. And as a country, I don't see why we would leave this to others, frankly.
What a great point. Thank you for joining us today, Robert.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.